I think there's a lot more subtle wins that can happen as well, that when we look back, it doesn't feel like this massive splash in the pool that just gets everyone wet, but it's something that can really start to set you up for a certain trajectory, or maybe shift the trajectory that you're on. There's a project that is probably, from a metrics perspective, right, using that initial measure that I talked about, 3D printing, is maybe the least successful thing I've done, right? Because it hasn't had this massive reach, and it didn't touch millions and millions of people or billions of people, but it is something that is very close to a world that I care about, and it is in line with the type of work that I want to do. And that was actually a book project. So I co-authored a book with a friend of mine specifically for people going through code schools. So the book is literally titled Code School, Helping People Kickstart Their Tech Career. And it was a passion that he and I both had, which is helping more people transition into technology. One thing that most people don't realize is the non-traditional way into tech is actually becoming the norm.
On this episode of the ProGuide, we have the Chief Technology Officer of SupportNow, Morgan J. Lopes. Today's episode of the ProGuide is brought to you by Small Pond Productions, the producers of this podcast. If you're looking to boost your brand's voice with professional end-to-end podcast production, whether it's an interview show or telling stories with audio, we walk you through every step of the process to make you sound great. Head to our website and download the free Podcasting Made Simple guide, 8 critical things you need to know before launching your brand's podcast. It's all available at smallpond.productions. Well, hey everybody, and welcome to this episode of the ProGuide. Today, I'm beyond excited to be able to have Morgan J. Lopes with us. Like we mentioned, he's the Chief Technology Officer of a company called SupportNow. Think of it as GoFundMe, but geared towards people that are going through seasons of grief or difficult times. And Morgan has started multiple businesses, including Polar Nation. He's an early investor and staff member from the team of Nectar. And this is a person that brainstorms ideas. And from his website, I love this quote: "If life were a gallon of ice cream, I'd be licking up every drop." I love that phrase. Morgan, thank you so much for joining us today.
I appreciate the invite. I'm looking forward to diving in.
Well, Morgan, I know that we've just given like the 10-second version of SupportNow, which used to be rebranded from Mialma. Tell us more about this project as a whole, where it fits in. Tell us just more about it.
Yeah, Mialma, we are excited to be helping families going through tough times, right? So there are a lot of tools and resources and supplements online to help families and people as they go through the exciting times of life. So weddings and babies, and we have wedding registries and baby registries and all these really exciting things. And in many ways, it's not just become an expectation, but it's almost a requirement, right? When these big happy seasons come around, people show up, and they show up en masse, and it's coordinated, and it's really well organized. It's a very tight experience. And one thing that we've noticed is we have nothing like that on the tough times of life. There are tools that will focus on maybe raising financial support, or you do have grief counseling when it comes to emotional support, but there are really no tools that bring all of those things together in the tough times of life. In many ways, as you would look around a lot of spots on the internet even, and you see really cool things like Chatbook, which my wife and I use to capture our kids' memories, and you look at the use cases that they highlight for Chatbooks. They're all exciting, happy things. And so in many ways, as a culture, we have not done a great job of elevating conversations around life's toughest times. And that's what we want to do. We want to elevate that conversation with Mialma and really help people show up for friends and family as they go through life's toughest moments. A couple of examples of what do I mean when I say tough times, right? Well, it could be the loss of a loved one. It could be illness. It could be a serious accident. All of these unexpected life moments, right, that we don't opt into or pick for ourselves, we can become pretty awkward. And in many cases, if we don't know what to do on behalf of loving and caring for others, then we do what is really the worst possible thing you could do, which is nothing. We hear this over and over again, that in tough seasons, you have this vanishing friend paradox, where people that you would have considered friends and family and loved ones, they don't know what to say, and they don't want to make it worse, and so then they do nothing. And that's pretty damaging to relationships. That's pretty damaging to the human psyche. Social support is such a huge element to the grieving process, to overcoming loss. And throughout our lives, we experience all forms of loss in all shapes and sizes, but we aren't really good at talking about it. And so we're trying to change that.
I think that one of the things I love so much about this idea is that it feels like really obvious, and not in the way that you shouldn't have thought of it, but it's one of those things where when people hear the concept, they think, why haven't I thought of this before now? Do you have any like recollection of an inception moment for this idea? Was this something that was just a low-level dull or ache in the back of your mind that was always there? Or was there that aha moment where it's like, this is what we've got to do?
My journey with Mialma started actually in having coffee with the founder, Scott, and I believe we were, talking through a number of potential startup ideas and problems that he was seeing. And something that I connected with almost immediately as he was sharing was this feeling of shame or of guilt as we are witnessing people who are hurting and not quite knowing what to do, right? And so there's this like disconnect. And I think many of us have felt that. And while most of us, while a large number of us may not have lost somebody we care about, right? You may not have had a really close family member die. We probably know somebody who has, right? And we've tried to be in that supportive role, and it's awkward, it's confusing, right? In our society, we don't really talk about death. And so how do you help and how do you teach people about something that you're kind of not supposed to talk about? And so as I heard that and we connected over that, I was like, all right, there's definitely something here. And in the early days, the bent was very heavy toward death, loss of a loved one. And as we started working on this idea, I spent about 2 years as an advisor, moving full-time in 2023 to help build out the product. It became clear that the lines between the death of a loved one and terminal illness or really like long-term chronic sickness, there's a lot of gray area. And in the minds of somebody who wants to show support, it may not really matter, right? What is the end state of the individual? Because it's all about my experience showing up for people I care about. And so we've broadened our aperture really to capture this entire segment that is underemphasized in our society. And I've had many conversations that go something like this. I share what we're doing, what we're working on, the change we're trying to make, and there's kind of this moment of pause, and the person will reply with, "Wow, it's amazing how many like niches are out there," or like, "Wow, that's a great, sounds like a great niche," and I'm thinking, what about this screams niche? Right now, I think in the sense of like our mind and the mind share that we give it as a society, yeah, it's a very small percentage. But when you start to peel it back and realize how much stress and anxiety and how much of our relationships are undergirded with trying to help other people or show up or show care, you realize, wow, this isn't something that is, 1 in 100 people, 1 in 1,000 people. It's every single person. And so whether you have gone through this, you are going through this, or will eventually go through this, right? That's 100% of people. And because we lack nuance of how to think about it, or talk about it, right? Now, I would actually start it with, because we don't talk about it well, then we don't usually think about it very well either. And so it can feel very like an isolated incident. But what's coming up over and over again is we have these conversations, and this happens every time, right? I get on a phone call with somebody and I'm talking about our business or trying to get some advice or insight as we march on. And everyone has their story of feeling helpless when a friend was in need, or maybe they themselves have lost somebody or navigated a chronic illness and have felt that disconnect that happens with friends and family. And so all of these things, it's unbelievable how integrated it is into all of our lives, and nobody's really talking about it. And so going back to your first question of, well, why is that? Why is this so under invested when we think about businesses and startups and all this opportunity? And the first thing that comes to mind is difficulty. There are just easier problems to solve. Right? I've been in technology for a long time, and I've created websites for everything from homemade baby food recipes to marketplaces for law firms and project attorneys, underwriting software for fintechs, right? And they are just really good spreadsheetable businesses that make a lot of sense, and you're not convincing somebody of the merits of a problem or the value in the solution, and it's simpler. And so the level of challenge, level of difficulty is pretty high on something like this because, and this is the second part, it's a really sensitive topic. Doing it well is hard. I myself am not the most empathetically inclined person. And as I start to navigate this world, one thing that I've realized is there's so much nuance in the words that we use and how we talk. And one tremendous level of appreciation that I have is technology gets beat up a lot for its biases and how unthoughtful it can be in the use of words or how inclusive it is and all of these things. And so as that trend has continued to just beat on the door of technology, it has helped moving into a space where we need to right out of the gate lead with a level of sensitivity, a level of openness to other people's lived experiences, and recognize that every single person, even though the situation could seem the same, right? You may have lost a parent, I may have lost a parent. We have our own unique experiences. And so navigating all of that, it's much more like victory by 1,000 wins rather than thinking there's one key insight that's going to unlock everything. It's a lot of small drip by drip improvements over something that, quite frankly, when I go back to the first part of complexity, there's just easier stuff to do, right? Things where I don't have to check myself as much, and maybe I don't have to spend as much time trying to understand your perspective or sit in this weird uncomfortableness of this life event that I don't quite understand and can never in a million years try, and I would never in a million years wish on somebody else. I just have to sit in that and be okay hearing that. And it's a very uncomfortable place. I know for myself, I have had many phone calls. I've had actually the most phone calls ever in this probably last 6 months of my life that have resulted in somebody's crying, right? It could be me tearing up in response to somebody's story. It could be them just being real and being honest. And one thing that I'm noticing is people are craving space to be this open. I've felt a level of discomfort, right? When we're having a conversation and you begin to share openly about something that you've experienced. Maybe it's a trauma, maybe it's a personal story of loss from your family, and people are very quick to apologize. And one thing I hear a lot is, I'm sorry for bringing down the conversation. And we hope to change that. You should not have to apologize for having a very normal human experience outside of your control and then seeking human connection in response to that, right? That's not a thing that should be apologizable, but it is what happens, and that's something that we hope to change.
That's so amazing. I know there's so many directions we can take this conversation. Most immediately to me, culturally, is that idea of the Amazon wish list, that happens at Christmas time. It was just such a weird idea when it first came out, but now it's just so super normal and culturally accepted, and people trade URLs, and you get exactly what you want at Christmas, which is fantastic. I feel like the concept of Mi Alma or SupportNow solves this at the systems level for the person that's really helping, and just makes it really immediately obvious where the need is and where I get to help somebody. And what you're describing is so much easier than having those difficult, awkward conversations, navigating that terrain. Somebody might even just have this amorphous blob of feeling where it's like, I don't even know what to say yet, or that I'm even ready to have somebody help me. And this kind of helps make explicit what my needs actually are. What are your thoughts in that direction? How does somebody navigate through that kind of peeling back? What do I actually need in this situation?
Yeah, excellent question. Most of what exists online today, that could be Meal Train, that could be GoFundMe, these tools usually require the griever or the family that's in distress to get their thoughts together enough to put together a plan or share those things. That is not how we want to operate by default. We want our position to be supporter-led, where if I'm trying to show up for you, you don't have to have put in the thought and strung those thoughts or ideas or needs together. I can lead with acts of service, acts of compassion, without the family having to get all their ducks in a row. So in some ways, it's actually the anti-wish list, right? Not the things that you don't want so much as to say, it doesn't require somebody sitting down and listing out everything, because in life's toughest moments, we're not thinking clearly. For many of us, it's the first time we've gone through it. And so how do we even begin to know what we need, right? That's so far removed from the headspace of somebody who's in duress, who's experiencing trauma, who's suffering. And so we want to be supporter-led. And in many ways, we're finding that we're one of the only platforms that are supporter-led by default, allowing supporters to come to the table first and either offer support or just start giving, just start putting themselves out there. And then a family being able to see that, oh, people do care. Oh, people are offering these things, and then being able to respond or customize the registry and things like that. All of the customization on behalf of the family can happen, but we believe that should not be the first starting point. The first point should be on the supporter leading with acts of generosity on behalf of the family.
That makes so much sense. What would you say is your ultimate vision for Me Alma, for Support Now? What is it that when you form a picture in your head and say, this is ultimate success for us? If I saw this, this would be a huge win for us.
One way that we talk about Me Alma is when support starts flowing, we want to be the pipes. Okay, so if you have this picture of a large water reservoir. The city that I grew up in is near this massive lake, and that lake fuels a ton of industry downstream, but it's because the water is pooled. And then it's able to be strategically released. Sometimes it's downriver and it powers a turbine at the local dam. Other times it's used for drinking, right? And you have this surplus of water that's generated and being able to be redirected in all the right places. And so when I think of at its best, what does that look like? Well, it looks like a community. As soon as a need starts to form, somebody gets diagnosed with a terminal illness, somebody passes away unexpectedly, there's a tragic house fire that happens within a community, that immediately a dam starts being built, that starts to pool resources. And then as needs start to become available or needs become online, it could be expenses are starting to be generated. It could be, in many cases, let's say the head of household is the one that passes. And now there's years into the future that need to be accounted for on behalf of the family, that support can start flowing in the right direction. So it's organizing larger sums of support and then doing a better job of directing those support dollars and those support efforts, right? Because it's not always money. It could also be showing up and cutting the grass. It could be bringing a meal. It could be taking the kids to summer camp, right? There's a lot of ways that support can show up over the short and long term, and that reservoir starts to act as something that can be distributed into the areas as needs arise.
Morgan, I want to switch the conversation just slightly and talk to me about, you've been involved in so many different kind of ventures. Which ones do you look back on and say, like, this for me was an ultimate leadership win? Like when I'm thinking about leading a group of people or an organization in a direction, I look back and it's like, this is what I really consider to be like, this was a win for me.
Yeah, there's a lot of ways I could answer this. One thing that feels most obvious is I worked at a global housing nonprofit called New Story for a number of years, and from a pure metrics perspective, right? We were part of the group that launched the world's first 3D printed home, the world's first 3D printed community in a low-income area in Mexico. And just from a pure numbers perspective, eyes and attention, by the traditional measure of success, it was awesome. A friend of mine, it felt like single-handedly wrangled all of the PR opportunities and over 1 billion impressions across YouTube and Facebook. And it was exciting. Even we look back on those times and we're like, oh, those 2018 vibes is what we would talk about as just this really special lightning strike thing that I think many people don't get to experience in their career. And I got to experience it alongside some really awesome people. And that was great. It was super impactful. I think we did a lot of work to push forward that technology and really to push forward the conversation, and doing it on behalf of low-income families first, right? That default, because usually it takes a long time for innovation to trickle out to the edges of society. And so it was really important to us that we got to be a part of pulling that future forward a lot faster on behalf of families who didn't have access to those kind of things. So that was kind of from an outward perspective, awesome, and being a part of it was wildly exciting. And I think there's a lot more subtle wins that can happen as well, that when we look back, it doesn't feel like this massive splash in the pool that just gets everyone wet, but it's something that can really start to set you up for a certain trajectory, or maybe shift the trajectory that you're on. And there's a project that is probably from a metrics perspective, right? Using that initial measure that I talked about, 3D printing, is maybe the least successful thing I've done. Right? Because it hasn't had this massive reach, and it didn't touch millions and millions of people or billions of people. But it is something that is very close to a world that I care about, and it is in line with the type of work that I want to do. And that was actually a book project. So I co-authored a book with a friend of mine specifically for people going through code schools. So the book is literally titled Code School, Helping People Kickstart Their Tech Career. And it was a passion that he and I both had, which is helping more people transition into technology. One thing that most people don't realize is the non-traditional way into tech is actually becoming the norm, right? More and more people did not go and get a computer science degree. They did not have some illustrious background programming in their parents' basement at 6 years old. They were doing something else, and they were on some other path. And I love that from the just transitional side of like allowing people to shift into something that is emerging, that is exciting, that has a lot of momentum. I think that from a career perspective has a lot of potential upside. So that's great. But really it also captures a certain type of professional. One thing that I bring up a lot, and I do some presenting to code schools, and we talk about all kinds of topics from hacking the interview process to refining your career, putting together your first pitch or job description, all these things. And one thing that I love is in a world where most people don't like their job, and we can all see there's business review articles, Inc. articles talking about 86% of people don't like their job. Well, most people just talk about it. Right? I think we've all been a part of maybe conversations with friends or that Thanksgiving dinner where somebody's complaining about their boss and their job and all these things. Most people are unhappy with their jobs and they just talk about it. But code schools have managed to do a great job of pulling in people who are transitioning from something else, right? In most cases, it's not somebody coming out of high school and going to a code school. They were somebody who was in food service. They were a bartender. They were an education major, and they're trying to transition and shift the trajectory of their lives. And so instead of just talking about it, they're taking action and they're doing something. They're signing up for a course. They're drinking from a fire hose of information for months in hopes of shifting their career. And so within that, it's not just the allowing people who maybe are at a disadvantage to transition their lives, but really putting myself in the room with other people who aren't just talking about how discontent they are with a certain situation, but grabbing the reins of life and really starting to steer the horse for themselves into a new direction. And all those things kind of converge around a bunch of stuff that it gets me very, very excited. And it's, again, drip by drip, right? So when I have a presentation or, I have, it comes up in somebody's Google search history, right? This market isn't that massive, though it is definitely growing. But it's something where, hearing stories and people's experience of encountering this content and feeling like it gave them something, right? It was a little puff of wind in their sail as they were trying to navigate all of these unknowns. And I think oftentimes we get very enticed by these big, sexy, exciting projects. And again, it was awesome. Whatever energy you may have perceived of 3D printing, I can tell you from the inside, it was just as cool or better. And then also, I think there's a lot of value to be had around doing the small things and doing it for the right reasons and for the right group of people. And so that's an area that continues to get me excited. And it's not a tomorrow win, like this year record-breaking growth thing. And I believe we've created something that year after year can continue to show up for people and be something, right? A guidebook along their way. And I think those types of projects have their place and can be just as special as the big splashy ones.
You may have touched on this a little bit already, but I want to give you kind of more explicit permission to head in this direction. What advice do you have for somebody that is just starting in some position of leadership? Maybe they just had a title put on them on their mantle. It could be a business, a nonprofit committee, anything, but just something with people involved, and they find themselves with this position. And do you have anything that just kind of fits as a first go-to or helpful bit of advice, or is it something that's really tailored to the individual there?
The first thing that comes to mind as you ask the question is, it comes back to my definition of culture. All right, so I would talk about culture as being a place where the people you're working with could work anywhere, but choose to work here. All right, so it's not saying that, oh yeah, this is kind of the best we could get, but it's saying like, no, these are excellent, right? Some of the best people we could get, and they're choosing to be here. They're continually choosing, showing up. They're enrolling in the work that we're trying to do. And let's say you were placed in a position where you didn't really get to pick your team, right? And you just said, hey, the last guy left and I fell into this thing, and here now I have this problem I have to figure out. I've got this group of people I have to corral. The next thing that comes to mind is vision. And without a vision, the people perish. I think without a vision for ourselves, first and foremost, we start to flounder, we perish as people. And so I think a team works much the same way. So even if you didn't get to pick the team, figuring out where are we going together. I got to sit in on a really like a workshop with the founder of Education Superhighway, this gentleman named Evan. And it was a small group of us. I think there were 6 or 7 of us on the call. Right out of the gate, he interrupted the flow of conversation and said, okay, how would we define success for our time together? And we were like, well, I don't know. We thought you were going to like tell us some stuff, right? And he's like, okay, well, this is the most important question. So let's take some time to figure out how we define success for our time together today. So we're going to spend an hour together. How do I know at the end of this hour that we did it, that it was time well spent, that it was worth it? And so as a group, we kind of fumbled through and we're like, okay, well, we think maybe like this or like this. And we're kind of, I call it like Goldilocksing, right? Like, well, this is kind of too hot, this is too cold, but we're somewhere directionally accurate, right? And he was okay with that. He was, very polite and, entertained our ramblings for a little bit. And we had an excellent session, very impactful. And then at the end, right, regrouping on, okay, so we said at the beginning this, and we're like, whoa, don't bring that back up, right? How often do we start a meeting with certain intention and then go way off course and then nobody's held accountable at the end, right? Well, he brought it back up, held us accountable for, all right, we said this was success. Did we do it? Right? And that was within a 1-hour meeting. And the parallel became very clear very quickly, which is, okay, how do you take this from just a meeting, which is a great use of time and is a really thoughtful question to ask, and map it to a business? How might your business benefit from clearly defining what success looks like? And I'm going to probably butcher this because it's been a while since I've read through this, but Education Superhighway, he gave an example from their own business. And his goal is to provide high-speed internet access to 99% of public school classrooms in the US. Right? High-speed internet, 99% of public schools in the US. And so, well, why is that powerful, Morgan? Well, because when I look at it and you say, okay, well, high-speed internet. So if you could get dial-up to somebody in rural West Virginia, it doesn't count, right? Oh, well, we got this really great opportunity and I know somebody from my sister-in-law's blah, 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 where we can get into a private school. Nope, we're looking for public schools. That does not put points on the board, right? It helps focus and drive direction. And then something beautiful happened. They were successful. I think it took 6 or 7 years, but by that point, they had put high-speed internet access in 99% of public school classrooms in the US, and they stepped back and said, okay, we've got 1% to go, and then it's at 100%, right? And again, I'm probably butchering the math here a little bit, or the timelines, but they got to a point where they're like, we did it. Now what? And most groups will never pause to ask themselves the question of, should we change our definition of success? Or should we evolve this? Momentum will carry you toward, well, of course we should do the last 1% because, we've already come this far. And their group sat down and they realized, I don't think moving the goalpost from 99% to 100%, I don't think that's our job. We got the ball here. And I think there's another team, there's a leadership group, there's maybe a more iterative team that can come in and they can just carry this mantle forward into the future. And so, yeah, we're not just going to do the thing that's expected. We're going to reevaluate based on new information in order to march forward. And so I think if you have a great culture, it starts to drive to that direction. If you don't get to pick the team you're with, but especially if you do, having a really clear definition of success for the big picture, but then backing it down into each individual moment, I think is really huge. And the last thing I would put, so kind of if I had a third point here, would be around velocity. I think velocity is essential for businesses. And velocity is defined by 2 things: speed, which oftentimes we just use it interchangeable for speed, right? Just like go fast. But that's not what velocity is. Velocity is speed plus direction. Where you're going matters a lot. And so if you aren't being thoughtful about the direction you're traveling, then you could be going really, really fast, way off course. And so there's a lot of value in constantly reevaluating, course correcting, and dialing in that speed plus the direction. And we've felt this, and I'm going to use Mialma for example, because this is just the heaviest context that I'm living in today. And every 2 to 3 weeks, we are having to dial and recalibrate. There are times where we go a little bit too far in the wrong direction. We have to adjust, right? So we're going to dial back the speed for a time so that we can change our direction. And then we can continue to push on, but we want to be constantly adjusting and calibrating against that. Some teams fall out of it's a practice, right? It's a skill that we develop over time to get used to working at a high speed and reevaluating direction. It takes a level of humility and leadership to admit that, hey, maybe this direction isn't working. Also to be open to other people within the leadership or within the company who may see something that you don't see. And so how direction gets defined and how speed gets calibrated, I think are two more in-depth categories we could talk about maybe at a later date. But those two things and how those get defined, but the frequency with which you reevaluate those and then set those intentions, I think can have a really massive impact on teams and is really overlooked. I personally, and this is absolutely a shortcoming of myself, but when it feels like the velocity is wrong, I get very squirmy. I get very restless. I think there are times where it may be perceived from team members as if like I'm angry or I'm like short-tempered or I'm upset. And I just have this constant feeling of like we're wasting time. Because if we could be heading in the right direction and we could be moving really quickly, well then if we're heading off course and we're moving slow, then it just starts to have this like loading wheel of recalculating in my mind of like, oh my gosh, what am I doing? Am I wasting my life? And I have this constant internal story of like, am I being a good steward of what limited time in life that we have when the velocity isn't right? And I'm trying to work on that. I'm trying to check in with myself better because sometimes it just makes sense to go a little bit slower. The military has this great expression where slow is smooth and smooth is fast. So sometimes the best way to be fast is to be slow and calculated and keep it smooth. And then there's other times that you just need to be slamming the pedal to the floor and moving as fast as possible to keep up with maybe it's demand or the opportunity that you have in the market. And the last point here would be judgment. Like all of these things require a continually refining level of judgment in order to make sure that we are getting these things right. And we won't always know in the short term, but I think through reflection and looking back over past decisions, evaluating our own biases, all these things can help contribute to better judgment to make sure that we aren't just going through the motions, right? But we're being intentional.
This was not a question in our notes before the show, but I just feel this in the conversation that we're having here. What do you feel like is giving you this passion, this drive forward? Because I noticed there's a lot of clarity and a lot of nuance in the words that you choose. You're very explicit and purposeful in the language that you choose when you're describing something. So I'm assuming that this is something that you've owned for years, but is there a way that you could kind of help guide people moving toward that direction of being intentional and specific?
Yeah, if my family would probably say that talking comes natural to me, sure, right? Making sure that it's something worth listening to, I think would be, my hope is that is something I've continually tried to hone over the years. So a moment comes to mind a few years ago, and I had this picture of my mind's kind of like this open space with balls bouncing around in it, different shapes, different sizes. And it felt like, there's probably like 6 or 7 things kind of bouncing around in there at any point in time. And every once in a while, I will bump into a situation or a life event. I'm like, ooh, that pertains to a thing that I've thought about. And it felt like I was spending a lot of energy with just these things continually like rolling over in my mind and not being able to, one, articulate them as effectively, and they were just popping in and out of my mind kind of uncontrollably. And so I'm like, okay, what do I do about this? And I got to work one day and I'm like, all right, I'm going to write this stuff down. And this wasn't like creating a blog post. This was grab a sheet of paper off the printer, white sheet of paper, and just start writing. And it could be like a nugget of a thing, right? So good culture. And you could work anywhere, but you want to be here, right? Like that kind of idea was like sitting there. I was like, okay, so I just like wrote that phrase. And another thing was like a little more long form of like, okay, here are some like bullet points of a subtask of a thing that I have to get done. And I just put it out there. And then if it was a task, like you just need to go do this, like, figure out your life insurance policy, then I would just put the task in the bottom right. So I didn't want, separating tasks from actual like thoughts or concepts. And so I started putting them on a sheet of paper. And then I realized, wow, it's not 7 things bouncing around in my mind. It was like 15 or 20. And I'm like, okay, that my perspective was pretty far off, right? So it felt like few, but there's actually way more there. And I started putting it down. What started to happen was it felt like it created more space for new things. I'm like, oh, this is very fascinating. So in pouring out what's in my mind. We don't do a good job of almost that like metacognition of evaluating what's going on inside of this mind. We have the assumption that because we spend all day in our heads that we're good at navigating those treacherous waters of the mind. And so as I started taking these things and I put them on paper, and they started to multiply and give birth to new ideas. Then I was like, okay, this piece of paper is a mess. I just completed 3 of these tasks. I realized I've just been procrastinating, so I just did that work. And so I got another sheet of paper. I said, okay, now let's start grouping these things. Let's group like things. And there's like, okay, this is like a category of like some personal stuff. This is some professional things. This is like freelance kind of professional. This is like my day job kind of stuff. And so I started grouping these concepts, right? So sheet of paper 2, 10 minutes later, right? We're not talking, this is like this massive undertaking. Bill Gates has this idea of a think week where he spends a week alone, and like, this is not that. This is moments of time on a blank sheet of paper, just trying to like put some words to these things that tinker around in our mind. And, page 2 of organizing these things started to evolve. And over time, what I realized is, wow, first of all, there's more going on in there than I realized. And if I can start to box up some of these thoughts and put words to them and really tease out the nuance that I think is there, what starts to happen is it starts to create more room. And instead of thinking of it like a room with a bunch of balls bouncing around, it started to feel a little bit more like a warehouse with some shelves and some boxes that had rows with labels on them. And over time, I would, kind of like fall into different areas of my mind. And this is like not some like, I'm just spending a bunch of time in transcendental meditation. This is not that. This is just trying to organize the mind. But I would step into a room, for example, like death, which is a topic I've spent a lot of time thinking about recently. And I get in there and realize, wow, this place is a mess. This room has a bunch of balls bouncing around that have no order. And so, okay, let me get out the sheet of paper. And so now I can start to break it down. And this mental picture, and I think Sherlock Holmes has this analogy of like the mind palace or whatever. And it's like maybe a more lowbrow version of it. And mine's like a warehouse, and there's like oil on the floor, and the shelves are kind of rusty and rickety, but it's there. And so as I started to just put in some energy, very light energy on a blank sheet of paper, trying to organize that, it created more room, which allowed more to grow and things to build and more nuance to be developed. And I think some of this comes back to being a software engineer. And there's this engineered approach that I appreciate in technology. I appreciate it in life, in relationships, in personal schedules. But I think our mind is this really magical place. And even now, as we see society working to replicate intelligence, right, and working very hard and spending a lot of energy and electricity trying to create artificial intelligence, we have it inside of us, all of us. We have this really special, unique thing that generates ideas, and it creates, and it has tremendous potential to collaborate and interact with others. But the interface with which we interact with others is usually bound by language. And so when we can use better words, or we can bring more nuance to a situation, then we can start to elevate the conversation. And just like our own minds become more organized, so too do our relationships and the conversations we have with others. And it begets this like really powerful snowball effect that, fast forward 10 years, 15 years of doing things like this, what's the impact? And I go back to, I think it was Einstein that said humans the human mind cannot comprehend compound growth, right? And so like we kind of, if you have anything to do with finance or investments, you kind of just know that concept is really powerful, and you put your money in this thing over long periods and it doubles and all these things. But the same thing is true with our minds. I think this constant like purging and reorganizing of our minds and trying to distill down our thoughts and package it up nice and neat. My hope is that as I get older and my mind isn't quite what it used to be, that by having it nice and tidy, at least I get a little more leverage out of those later years. And also that hopefully as I move into older and older ages, that a momentum has been established of how to think, and the rituals around organizing thought and language begin to serve me and my family in ways that I would have hoped previous generations would have invested in. But it's been very rewarding personally to feel like I can walk through certain areas of my mind, and things are, there's a thing for everything and everything in its place. And very often I have to tear down all the shelves and upend all the boxes and put it back together because I was wrong. And that happens more often than I care to admit. But it's way easier to see that and evaluate when you have put some thought into constructing those ideas and create a space for it.
Gosh, Morgan, I love that idea of building a ritual around thinking accurately and having that compound interest show up over a time in the future. Have you ever seen those videos of like the 90, 95-year-old violin players who are just like barely scuffling along, and then as soon as they have the musical instrument in their hand and they get warmed up, all of that muscle memory just kind of takes it back over, and they're in that magical place where like their talent is just shining. And so getting to think about what that looks like mentally and how that might serve you in the future is actually really exciting. So I think maybe just one final question, and you leaned a little bit into AI, and I'd be remiss if I didn't even ask about it or talk about it, because I feel like you do have some interesting ideas there. What is it that fascinates you about AI? And it might not necessarily be what's currently in the hype machine about, oh, it can help with content creation or generate marketing ideas, or you can leverage it when crunching through huge amounts of data. But I'd love to hear just your take on what's some of that lesser known space that you find yourself looking in.
I don't think you can really talk about the value of AI without talking about the Industrial Revolution. So if we're going to look forward, I think we need to actually look back in time quite a bit. And something really special about humanity, about people, was taken from us when we started to be treated like cogs in a machine. You show up, you sit here, we are trying to make you replaceable. We are reducing you down to the fact that you have small fingers that fit in these small holes, right? And that the impact of that, of stripping out so much of what makes humans unique and just actually trying to distill it down to what's the same about all of us. And I think it took something from people. And so that's lasted for decades. And today we have humans who are doing jobs that I do not believe are meant to be done by humans. Humans are just the most flexible creature that could satisfy that business need or that operational need or the assembly line. It was too expensive to develop the technology, and so we just put a human there. And so I think that season of business did incredible things on the world stage for growth, for capitalism, all of that. It was a wildly successful economic engine, but it took something from us as people. And one of the most valuable things that I see when I look at AI is it's a chance to take that stuff back. Because the most unique things about humans that sets us apart from things that could be created or replaced or cogs in the machine is our ability to collaborate and our ability to adapt and to flex to change over time. And you could look at an AI large language model or some machine that's been properly calibrated and say like, no, you don't understand. This thing is really flexible and it can adjust to changing environments. Like, yeah, to a point, right? But even still, when you look at the energy usage required to train an AI model is massive, where the human mind can do it with a fraction of the same amount of energy. And you say like, yeah, well, it can't hold as much info. It's like, you're right. But also what the human mind is good at is determining what information needs to be held onto and what just doesn't matter, right? And so, of course, tons of amazing advancements, but I think more and more as we look at AI, and AI will absolutely take jobs. There's no questions. But I think some of the first jobs that it's taking are jobs that it's about time humans let those go anyway. And I think it frees us up to start to look toward more of the things that computers can't take yet. And maybe eventually, sure, they'll be able to collaborate better than we can and they'll be more adaptable than we can. But I believe it's way further off than we believe. I think a lot of, there's a very far distance between ChatGPT-4 and true general intelligence that's going to be gobbling up all of the really creative jobs. And so, yes, it's uncomfortable when entire swaths of industries and markets and countries lose certain types of labor. But when we look at what type of labor was it, I have a friend who spent years of her career writing SEO articles for cell phone repair companies. Okay, so imagine a person writing thousands of articles unique to like hyper-local search results pretty much like keyword stuffing based on geography for thousands of articles for years. And I look at that and I'm like, she's incredibly intelligent, a smart person, an excellent writer. And she's essentially writing for the machine of Google so that when I search for cell phone repair in Duluth, Minnesota, that I find this franchise. Is that the best use of her time and her talent and her energy? I don't think that it is. And so will generative AI be able to spit out that article better and faster and cheaper? Yes. And now she gets to go find something else to do. And I think at its most powerful, or especially in the journey between here and there, the professional gets to figure out, how do I integrate this into my workflow such that I get to be better? One thing that I've really enjoyed with generative AI is GitHub's Copilot. So as a software engineer, when I'm writing code, Copilot comes alongside me and kind of like almost like in the background, and this muted text will suggest what it thinks the next line of code will be. Plenty of times it's absolutely wrong, and I need to have judgment, and I need to know my craft enough to know when it gives me something that's total crap. But there are plenty of times where when I'm just copy and pasting stuff into trying to replicate this thing across many different functions, and it anticipates that, and I just press tab, enter, tab, enter, tab, enter. It took something that would have taken me, 3 minutes to do, and I just did it in 3 seconds, right? And so that's not for everything, but there's a lot of these things that, I don't like just copy pasting these little snippets throughout my code base. It's great that the computer steps in and says, hey, I got you. Let me do this really tedious thing that you're not best fit to do anyway, because that frees me up to stay in the flow of solving problems. And I do not believe that, if I just look at programmers, for instance, or even writers, right? We are not, I resist the temptation to think about software engineers as coders, because coding is talking about the thing you do. That's like saying a carpenter is a hammer swinger. It's like, no, they swing hammers, but they are not a hammer swinger, right? And it's similar, like a writer is not a word typer, right? That's like, no, that's just a functional thing to get out the creativity and that energy. And a lot of really creative, thoughtful work has to go into getting things done. And what if we could just groom out all of the tedious things that are really just us having to interface with something and allow us to accelerate the speed with which our ideas come to life? I think, again, back to that idea of a snowball. I think that snowball starts to build up steam pretty quickly when you unleash humans to do what they do best and get all of the other stuff out of the way.
Morgan, this is so great. I'm honored and grateful that we've gotten to have this conversation. I think it adds huge value to people if they take the time to listen to your ideas. How can folks connect with you and what you're up to find out more?
Yeah, I would love to connect. You can reach out. My website is morganjlopes.com. And as I was sharing about showing up for friends and family who are going through hard times, I would encourage you to show up for them and check us out, mialma.com, and build a support registry for somebody in need in your life. You don't have to wait for permission. Chances are they are underwater, so take action and show up with love and care for people that mean the most to us. I think there are very small expressions of love and support that we can show, and I think it goes a long way when people are struggling. So I encourage you to do that, and look forward to seeing you online.
That's perfect. Thank you so much, Morgan.
Yeah, likewise. Your time is your most valuable resource, so thank you for spending it with us.
And our thanks to all of you for listening. If you're looking for a quick way to make our day, a review in iTunes or subscribing to this podcast would mean the world to us. Our thanks to Small Pond Productions for sponsoring. And this was the ProGuide. Learn from leaders, change your life. See you, everybody.